The Russian Federation is being betrayed by its best and most important partners. They were supposed to be friends. But was that really true? China and India, due to the absolutely terrible and harsh sanctions imposed by the United States just a few days ago, are already massively refusing to buy Russian oil. Or is that what the Western media wants us to believe? And not just them, even some analysts who are supposed to be independent are already echoing these kinds of reports, and in some cases, they even delete them right after. Whatever the case, of course, the commotion has already started. Russia is going to be harmed by this action from the United States and the rest of the world. It's China and India, not just any country, and they're bowing to Uncle Sam's will, and therefore directly to Donald Trump's. But how much of this is actually true? Are these proven facts or just Western propaganda? Stay until the end of this video, because here we're not only going to analyze whether China and India have really stopped or are going to stop buying Russian oil, but also to introduce you to the fascinating and absolutely magical world of canal oil production. Because what we're talking about here is something almost no one dares to analyze. But above all, stay until the end, because there you'll find a magical story that's going to explain everything to you. Where will China and India get oil from without Russia losing money? Let's start the detailed analysis. We'll begin, as usual, from the very beginning. Recently, following what seems to be the possibility of an agreement between the United States and the Russian Federation for a solution to the conflict in Ukraine, which now seems like anything but a sovereign country, Donald Trump has decided to throw a tantrum and impose sanctions against Russian oil. The affected companies are two in particular, Rosneft and Lukoil, as well as 34 companies that are related to the previous two. This, in theory, affects the direct income of the Federation, and therefore the course of the special military operation. What they want is the same as always: to try to suffocate Russia by sinking its economy. Without money, it can't keep defending itself from NATO. Oh, sorry, as the Western media would say, to keep carrying out its terrible aggression against Ukrainian territory. Anyway, the goal of the collective West is very clear: for Russia to be left without a penny. What Russia has the most of, what it sells the most, is precisely energy resources. So they've started with one of the most important ones, which is oil. The Russian Federation has reacted to all of this in several ways. Vladimir Putin has responded in his usual way, quite calm, composed, and measured, while Dmitry Medvedev has described it as an act of war. In any case, both of them, along with other very important figures within the Russian Federation, insist that these sanctions will have hardly any effect, much less on the course of the special military operation, which they claim will end with the victory of the Russian Federation. Donald Trump has already responded to that, saying that the sanctions will need at least 6 months, and that's when the first results will be seen. Whether that's true or not, only time will tell. Either way, we're here to understand whether Russia has really been betrayed or not, and to what extent will it have to stop selling its oil, and therefore suffer damage to its economy. And for that, it's absolutely necessary to introduce several concepts from basic economics, or something like a brief crash course on how the energy resources market works. The first and most important thing you need to know, not just for this market, but for life in general. Or maybe not. Should we be even more general? The law? The highest and most universal law of energy worldwide. Let's go with it. Nothing comes from nothing, nor does anything go to nothing. Does it sound familiar that energy can't be created or destroyed, only transformed? Or, in other words, applied to the energy resources market, natural resources, yes, also in terms of energy, are what they are. And the needs of the countries in this regard as well. Come on, Liu, don't tell me, please, that oil production can't just be increased with the snap of a finger by, for example, Donald Trump. And yes, the truth is that it can't be done. Oops. First little problem, that is, The Russian Federation produces the amount of oil that it produces. And I'm not going to clarify this for you now, but rather the president of that country himself will. The rest of the countries internationally, of course, do the same, and all of them need the oil they need. It may sound redundant, but it's the key to understanding the situation in general terms. That is, if extremely dangerous and harsh sanctions are imposed, and for whatever reason, if you can't buy Russian oil, that oil has to come from somewhere else. If larger quantities aren't produced, then we're going to have a problem that, as a direct consequence, will lead to a price increase. But even with that, it's not really going to be completely solved. Wait, I actually promised you that I wouldn't be the one to tell you this. So there is the president of the Russian Federation with his extremely summarized masterclass on basic economics, or more specifically, on how the energy resources market works, applied to the situation with the sanctions.
There's nothing pleasant about it, but if we look at it objectively and professionally in this economic aspect of these sanctions, what do we see? Now, the United States, in my opinion, produces 13.5 million barrels a day and takes first place. Second is Saudi Arabia with around 10 million, and the Federation is in third place with around 9.5. The United States consumes 20 million, they sell some and buy even more, mainly from Canada. So they produce 13.5 and consume 20. But the Russian Federation and Saudi Arabia sell more oil and petroleum products. I might make a mistake in something just off the cuff, I might mix something up, but the general order will be close to reality. Saudi Arabia sells about 9 million tons of oil and petroleum products to the foreign market. The Russian Federation, 7.5. So our contribution to the global energy balance is very significant, and now this balance, both in the interests of consumers and producers, has been established. Breaking this balance is a very thankless task, including for those who are trying to do it. Why? Well, first of all, I have to say that overall production is currently at rock bottom. Of course, it's possible to replace some part, obviously not all, that's impossible, but some part of Russian oil and petroleum products on the world market. First, this takes time. Second, it needs major investments. For the first time recently, we've heard from the International Energy Agency that it is encouraging and urging economic participants to invest in hydrocarbon energy. Until now, it was the other way around. They used to say, including within the framework of the International Energy Agency, that investments should be made in alternative energy sources. Yes, it is necessary. But it became clear that at least for the next few years or decades, we can't do without hydrocarbons. That's obvious. It's obvious. With the growth in consumption, the global economy is growing and energy consumption is increasing. Well, so it's just not possible to sharply increase it all at once. But if the amount of our oil and petroleum products on the world market suddenly decreases, prices will go up. And my American colleague and I also talked about this. What will this lead to? This will lead to a sharp increase in the cost of oil and petroleum products, including for drivers at gas stations. And the United States is no exception. And if you take into account the domestic political calendar in the States, it's clear how sensitive some processes will be in this regard. And those who are advising the current administration to make such decisions, you have to wonder who they are really working for. But that's not important. I mean, what matters to us is something else, that we feel confident, stable, and secure despite certain losses. And they, of course, are related to many circumstances. However, our energy sector feels quite secure.
In summary, in a very brief summary, if there is less oil than needed, and above all, if we apply that law about energy to this, or, well, in this case, oil is neither created nor destroyed, it just transforms. Well, indeed, Russian oil may at some point have to be transformed into some other oil that has absolutely nothing to do with Russia. But wait, this is exactly what we're going to see from now on. Because I have something prepared for you, the 5 main reasons that respond, on one hand, to these increasingly numerous articles written by Western media about the betrayal of the Russian Federation, at the same time from China and India. But, moreover, and above all, these are 5 reasons that perfectly explain why the supposedly feared sanctions from Trump, they come to an end. Most likely they will end up coming to nothing, or in other words, they won't really affect either the Russian Federation or the sale of Russian oil too much. Let's go. First point, wasn't the Russian Federation prepared? Seriously? We're here to talk about something like the eternal Western mistake, which, for some reason, seems to constantly underestimate the ability of the Russian Federation to respond. And Russia as an adversary itself? For example, recently, Mr. Root from NATO was speaking in extremely derogatory terms about the military power of the Russian Federation, stating that NATO could shoot down Russian planes if necessary, which he had to clarify a few moments later, saying that since we are stronger, we won't have that need. If the military planes in question don't pose any danger, this example is perfectly applicable to everything else. There have already been 19 victorious sanction packages that so far haven't worked. And in fact, the first ones should have been absolutely deadly. The West made the mistake of dropping the biggest bomb in terms of sanctions right from the start, disconnecting the Russian Federation from the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication System. Those damn Russians will see what's good, they said in 2022. Their economy will be absolutely ruined. But well, it's been at least 3 years since then, and it doesn't seem like Russia is even considering minimizing its involvement in its own special operation. Don't tell me the evil Russians, as if they had known about it beforehand. And yes, most likely, no matter how surprising it is to both Western leaders and the media, the Russian Federation was already prepared for those sanctions. So, what exactly should make us think that Russia wouldn't already be just as prepared for these sanctions in advance as well? Is the West really prepared? Here we analyze the issue from, let's say, the opposite perspective, because while the preparation on the part of the Russian Federation has been going on for a long time, the preparation or lack of preparation on the part of the West could also end up working against, in this case, the West itself. A terribly bad trick. And once again, when we talk about the possibility that oil could start to become scarce, they will have to go up, which they already have. Is the West really prepared for this scenario? Because here it faces problems that are at least twofold. Let's separate the European Union from the United States. But the conclusion we reach is basically the same. On one hand, the European Union faces oil shortages, and therefore rising oil prices. This will inevitably translate, at the very least, into public discontent, but it could also have devastating economic consequences. In the United States, the situation is even more serious because the American population is infinitely more sensitive to rising oil prices. It needs to be said, not just by me. Even Vladimir Putin himself has said it. But ultimately, the facts and data speak for themselves. The United States, I repeat, needs a lot of oil, and there is only so much in the world. So it not only has to meet its own needs, but also deal with the very likely public discontent, which usually translates into terrible election results for the party that's in power. At the moment when these price increases happen, come on, why do you think the United States is now getting fully involved in the fight against drugs at the international level? Venezuelan. So what is it that Venezuela has that could matter so much to them? Wow, I think I'm starting to understand you now. It starts with a P, and it's not exactly the president, is it? Point number 3, which kind of contradicts point number 2, but in a very special way. The West is not ready. Seriously? And it's really important to understand that politicians and their statements are one thing and something very different. Most of the time, or even the vast majority, it's the companies and the economy overall. So, while some are introducing the toughest sanctions, The others usually try to get around them however they can, for the money. Money doesn't care about patriotism, especially if it's only American patriotism. So, with almost total certainty, Western companies, and here we're also talking about Chinese companies, and of course, Indian ones, will they somehow be tricked into continuing to do exactly what they've actually been doing since at least 2022? Well, actually, pretty much since 2014 itself, when some sanctions were imposed on Russia because of the Crimea issue. We could mention the Russian Shadow Fleet, but for me it's very activity that is already very much involved in exchange. African Naciones Inmuebles, the Zacion to be elected, but that expressly allows white. But Germany, please, don't mess with it anymore. Yes, I didn't want to admit it. But the truth is that with Nord Stream 2, we've had enough. Point number 4. What will the rest of the world do exactly? I mean, will they obey Trump's order just like that? Here, the most important thing to mention is, above all, the fact that the vast majority of the world's population, the vast majority, I would even say, do not live in the countries belonging to the so-called collective West. And in fact, they have no problem whatsoever with the Russian Federation, even considering that it is carrying out its special military operation in Ukraine at this very moment. So even in the case that China and India betrayed Russia, which we will see in a moment, to what extent could this be true or not? Russia could always end up finding new buyers. Point number 5. So what will China and India do? The question remains the same. Simply obey, even bow to Trump's wishes. There are several issues to mention here. On one hand, the official statements from both countries. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs has expressed its deep rejection of the new sanctions imposed by the United States on the main Russian oil companies. China consistently opposes unilateral sanctions that are not based on international law or authorized by the United Nations Security Council. This was stated by the ministry's spokesperson, Go Yakub. For its part, India's response also clearly showed the distance from the constant Western pressures. Indian Minister of Commerce Piyush Goyal made this statement at the Berlin Global Dialogue Conference. India considers it unacceptable to receive external instructions about whom to be friends with and trade with, and whom not to. In addition to the official stance, we must mention another absolutely key issue: the needs of both countries. And I would even say more, the ever-increasing needs, because we are talking, unlike those of the collective West, about two economies with inconsistent development, Jungle and Jindu. They need energy resources like no one else, energy resources in huge quantities, and the cheaper, the better. That is, even if they have to stop, even partially, buying Russian oil officially. Do we really think that these countries aren't prepared? That they weren't prepared for what Donald Trump was preparing in the offices of the White House? Are we really going to believe that intelligence, neither China's nor India's, is absolutely useless? Of course, since they live without Starlink, they must still be in something like the Middle Ages, in absolute darkness, without a single thought. This, of course, relates to these Western headlines. They have to do with the concept that people usually have of everything that isn't part of this precious European garden. Or here we could say, we are progress, the rest is barbarism. But the truth is that the reality on the map and in the actions of the different international actors usually has nothing to do with this Western collective imagination. Here I repeat the question, and little by little, we are going to get closer to the most magical and intriguing part of this video. Seriously, do we really have to believe that China and India weren't prepared for these sanctions? They don't know how to get around them, and they're just going to run out of oil in the event that it can't be produced beyond the Russian supply, which I can already tell you. It can't be produced beyond the Russian supply. Do we believe it? Or maybe we're not that stupid. Point 6. The magic begins. We're almost in the story now. Does Russian oil have the gift of transformation? Yes, you heard that right. Just a drop of oil, for example, Lithuanian, or from any other country, is enough for Russian oil to suddenly transform. Yes, that's right. For example, in Lithuanian oil. Wow, very interesting. But wait, and what about Lithuanian oil? And what about India? Among many other countries, of course. They could buy it in an easy and simple way, right? Right? So, the only thing that needs to be done is to reorganize that supposed Russian shadow fleet, which actually shouldn't even exist, since in many cases, transactions for this oil have been carried out since the first Western sanctions in other currencies that are not the dollar, and therefore, the United States can't do anything about it. Nothing stops Russian ships from going to a point, let's call it X, where the initially Russian oil can actually be mixed with a little bit of any other type of oil. So it stops being Russian, just like that. Thank you so much for sticking with me until now, but I promise you it's going to be totally worth it, because this is where the real magic begins. I'll tell you a story. Wait. Imagine one of those countries, modern and very focused on the economy, something like an economic paradise everywhere, where the big companies are located. There are several, but let's take one as an example. Singapore. Well, once upon a time, in a very spacious and very modern office in one of the tallest skyscrapers in Singapore, a company dedicated to selling oil. One that has nothing to do with the Russian Federation, and therefore it can trade with all companies internationally without that implying any kind of sanctions violation. Well, it turns out that precisely in this company, let's call it, for example, Lucky Petrol. And let's continue with Lucky Petrol, a company located in one of the most important and beautiful skyscrapers, right in the center of Singapore. It turns out that something inconceivable has happened, something that had never happened before, or only very rarely. But of course, that doesn't make the event itself impossible, not at all. It turns out that at Lucky Petrol, they have discovered the oil is right underneath the skyscraper where his office is located. What a lie, you might say. Magic, I'll answer. Floods and floods of oil gushing directly from the center of Singapore, collected, processed, put into barrels, and sold to the highest bidder who could, oh my God, be Chinese or Indian. You can take it however you want, as a simple fairy tale, I mean, complete nonsense, or, for example, as a metaphor for what is actually happening in reality. With the energy resources market, I repeat the saying here, oil is what it is. It's needed the way it's needed. There won't be more produced, nor will less be needed. So what this is about is finding the exact story that convinces all parties enough. Where oil, instead of springing from the land, the homeland of the Russian Federation, does so officially, of course from anywhere else. A place, I repeat, as magical as it is wonderful, from which China and India, among others, will extract oil, of course, including those from the collective West, without Russia not losing a single ruble. I am Liu Sivaya, a geopolitical analyst and Donbas war correspondent. Follow me so you'll never be fooled by Western propaganda.